Hi, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels I'm an addiction psychiatrist, and I work in Southern Vermont.
My name is Robert Stack, and I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, licensed mental health counselor. Good evening. How are you?
So we have some cards and questions tonight, but first, there's a pretty important episode of 60 Minutes that came on this weekend.
Right, and I think it was, I've been in the field and and it was about Anthem Insurance, and they did a thing where someone was denied treatment, and they had a couple examples of individuals. Some of them died. I mean, a couple of them had to sue and everything, but it was a window on the how this is done. And I guess, I'm so used to it, and I'm sure you are too, and your experience is that, negotiating with the insurance companies for length of stay in a hospital, it started almost on a mission, I mean, quite frankly. And boy, I can remember people on the phone and just doctors just relentless, all right, can I speak to someone else? No, so it was really an eye-opener for some folks.
Yeah, and again, business as usual. I mean, it was always such an adversarial process too. You knew, but just it felt like convinced that the person on the other end of the line with the insurance company was prone to saying no. And this became a matter of sort of persuasion, of a debate, in order to convince them to eke out some extra time that we thought was very important for treatment. And it was maybe in all the time I was doing inpatient work and throughout my outpatient time too, I think maybe twice did it ever feel like it was a cooperative process, where they were really asking me and caring about, okay, what are the goals here? How's the treatment going? What are the hurdles? What can we do to sort of help make sure this person gets better in hospital follow-up care? But for most of the time, it felt like it was sales and conflict.
Right.
So and experience with Anthem was just what they said there, and with a lot of other insurance companies too.
Right, and it was sort of interesting. I mean, I don't mean to laugh. I mean, it was sort of one of the ways that it was so struck me was that they talked about Anthem. The guy actually mentioned it. He said, there's a quarterly report. It's a corporation. Corporations have a requirement to the shareholders to maximize their returns on their investment. And so here you're treating a chronic illness. They were talking about a woman with anorexia, I believe, and it was an eating disorder, long-term treatment. And corporations, they always say this, I don't know how true it is, but they say, they're so tuned into the quarterly report. Well, that's every 90 days. That's it's every 90 days, and you're looking at your profit margin, and people make estimates how much per share you're going to make. Anyway, without getting into it, but they sort of said that, and I think I've said this before. I believe Governor Dean one time, right at the end of his term, said, well, I'm not sure that a for-profit corporation and healthcare, they don't really necessarily go together. And I think that's especially true with chronic illnesses like addiction and mental illness. I mean, it's very hard to sort of figure that out. If you figure out, if we spend less money this quarter, we'll have more profit this quarter. And when you're treating chronic illness over a long period of time, I don't know if you really want to make measurements by quarter, per quarter. But it's part of it.
These are, we consider these to be sort of chronic problems with depression, anxiety, substances. This is years and years and years, lifetimes. And if working with these corporations, they're not taking that long-term view. So there's a real disconnect here that I hope someday with single payer or wherever affordable care goes, that somebody takes this long-term perspective on these issues.
Right, and I don't know, I watched 60 Minutes, and later in the show they had something about mindfulness, which I really sort of enjoy. I've been trying to practice meditation. Now, meditation is sort of mindfulness with spirituality. I mean, it's mindfulness, I think, is almost a secular approach to meditation. It's about living in the now, living in the present, taking a time out. And they prefaced it as cutting out the constant communication, people checking their iPhones and everything. Right. And they had this thing where they passed a basket and everybody put in their devices. Wow. And disconnect, if you will.
I've heard of summer camps for grown-ups where you no electronics.
Well, the interesting thing is they were doing it at Google. I mean, the most of the show took place at Google, and these are the people who sort of do it, and yet they're trying to give them to practice meditation to reduce their stress and anxiety. And I thought the interviewer was pretty good about it. He was sort of a disbeliever, saying this is all just bunk, and everything. But as a little 15 minutes, 10 minutes, wherever 60 minutes gives you, he came to say, well, I found it helpful. It did make a difference. And I think that's, AA used to say, the only people that scoff at prayer are people who don't pray.
Right.
I mean,
our power went out this week with the heavy snow. We were without it for about 24 hours. And when you wake up and you come home and you realize just how absolutely still that it is, then it makes me realize when it comes back on, the hum of the refrigerator, the fans, the heat coming on, that we're bombarded with all these unnatural noises all the time, and how it's almost nice when the power goes out because it's so peaceful.
Except it gets cold. But you have a wood stove, right?
Hauling wood and hauling water, man. It's a good health. It's another kind of mindfulness.
There you go.
Yeah. Hey, we should do some honor to these questions.
Hey, this is great. We didn't show it in the beginning, but there's a way to reach us.
Oh my gosh, yes. Right, we have a Facebook site at facebook.com/letstalkvt, and you can email us at questions@letstalkvt.com.
And really, I mean, our hope was to make this program an interactive one with the audience and sort of reply to questions and comments and stuff. And so anything that people can do, even if you don't like us or negative comments, any comments.
Write that too.
Yeah, too. But if you have questions, don't hesitate. It would just make the show that much more meaningful, I think, in a way. I mean, we don't need to be just talking heads up here. We actually want to be helpful to people in the audience. So please, if you have any comments or questions, please ask.
Right. Well, here, this is along those lines, Robert. I'm getting told to go to AA, but I don't like hanging out with a bunch of drunks talking about drinking.
Yeah.
I find it counterproductive, and it makes me want to drink.
I guess he drinks alone. Otherwise, if he goes to bars, he sits around and talks with people who are drinking. So
right.
He must be a lonely drinker.
Yeah. The drunks who aren't drinking, that's a whole nother area, huh? I mean, we hear this a lot, right?
Yeah.
It's very complicated, right, to seek sobriety, and how well things work. We have to admit we're probably still figuring that out. But one thing that is clear is that the 12 steps, I mean, AA in particular, as long as it's been around and it's been studied, seems to be the most effective thing we have. Right? There's no such thing as one size fits all. But I hear this a lot, that I don't like it, I don't want to go there. Yeah. It's just as this person said, it's just a bunch of drunks glorifying drinking, and it makes me feel worse.
They have this thing, AA, they talk about the first step and the first step of AA, and they have an explanation of the steps. And in this thing, it says it refers to AA as being a life preserver, lifesaver. And the first step says, that people are going to die from it. And if you can visualize, if you were drowning and someone threw you a life preserver, you would hold on to it. Would you criticize it if they threw it to you this way or that way, or
the wrong color,
would you say, "Gee, it was the wrong color"? And that's one of the, not criticisms of AA, but it really works for people who want to get sober. And you say, well, there's a chance that if you go to this room and sit in this room with these people, you're going to get sober. And for people who are not really sure they want to stop drinking, they find reasons why they don't like AA. I mean that. They really, and I don't know whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, but if you want to find a reason why you don't like AA, you can go from the bad coffee, the cookies, the people, the topics, whatever you want. There's plenty of reasons why you don't like AA. But if you're a desperate alcoholic that wants to get sober, and you go into a meeting, and if you go to enough AA meetings, you'll stop drinking. And if that's all you want, if that's your fervent desire is to stop drinking, you'll fall in love with AA because it will work.
And I think too, but some people are very private, introverted, shy.
Yeah.
Group setting can be very difficult for them.
Yeah, but the AA is like a room full of loners. And you know, you might be shy and introverted, but you know, when you get your DWI and they put your name in the paper, that's going to kind of blow it. You know, when you lose your family and your job and your health, it might be time to overcome your shyness. Right. I just mean, I don't mean that like to be mean, but you know, I used to talk to clients all the time, and they would put up resistance, and I've been taught, you know, to roll with resistance. But at some point, you just go, well, I guess maybe if you don't want to do this, do it by yourself. Yeah. But almost everybody I talked to had already tried to do it by themselves. That's why they were talking to me, because if they were successful, they wouldn't come see me.
Well, I'm wondering, maybe an open heart. I mean, as I've heard about relationships, maybe making a point of, instead of focusing on things you don't like about a person, remember what you do like. Find the things that are positive and look at those, and that can really change your perspective.
And you know, I read something the other day that says, you know, a guy agreed to go talk to some people in AA, and he said, I don't think it will work for me, but I understand it will help them.
Okay.
So, so maybe, you know, maybe that's what you need to realize, that, you know, hey, you could go help these drunks and just listen to them, you know, and they'll feel better and they won't drink. You know, I don't know. I mean, if somebody doesn't want to go, don't go. I'm sorry to, you know, to say it that bluntly, but if you want to stop drinking, go.
Yeah, but maybe being sure to have an open heart would be the starting point.
All right.
Okay. So this question, I have anxiety, fear about the future, and my doctor wants to prescribe an antidepressant or Valium. How come? Okay. Sounds like they don't quite have faith in what the doctor is thinking about here with the prescription.
You wonder sometimes. I mean, you know, I told you when I briefly worked for Otter Creek Associates, I noticed that some folks wanted me to write a script for benzodiazepines.
Like Valium, is it?
Valium or Xanax or, you know, whatever. And I would tell them, no, I don't have that, I can't do that, you know, I mean, I'm not a prescriber. And they would sort of lose interest a little bit, you know what I mean? It was sort of, I said, well, I could talk to you. I can talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. We can see how that works. I don't know enough about it, and maybe you should answer this part of it, but I think antidepressants, sometimes anxiety and fear, aren't they almost the same thing? Sometimes aren't they? I mean,
yeah, I mean, how do you sort this out? So maybe there's a couple of parts to this question. On the one hand, I'm sort of reading into it that maybe there's reluctance towards medications, and I think that's perfectly fine, if not absolutely, you know, wonderful. Because one of the things we don't do as often as we should is sort of look at different sort of algorithms through treatment. And when you're talking about something like anxiety, the first thing you should do is talk about counseling. I mean, fear the future, like you mentioned, cognitive behavioral therapy. This has a lot to do with the way you're looking at the unknown, the way you're sort of framing the possibilities of the future. And you can learn a way to examine that and look at the evidence around that can really significantly decrease, you know, anxiety and sadness around the situation. And
again, you know, I don't want to. I personally, and I don't think you either, want to judge the doctor who's sitting in an office talking to a person.
Right, we're missing the history.
That's right. We're missing the history. We're missing a lot of other information, and it's just from their perspective. And so, you know, I would go back to the doctor and ask him. Yeah. You know, why are you recommending an antidepressant? I've been on them, they don't work, and I'm really anxious, and, you know, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I hope I'm right on my history, but Valium was Mother's Little Helper, right? Mm-hmm. And it also has addictive, well, let's put it, it's an effective medication for people who are seriously anxious, like, for example, getting ready to undergo a medical procedure, like an MRI, for example. Yeah. This is a wonderfully effective medication. You're not anxious anymore.
Right.
One of the issues around those, you have to think about sort of risks and benefits of any treatment, and it has a potential for addiction. Right. It feels so good that it's possible that you'll get, say, hooked on this and potentially have withdrawal from it. So when you talk about medications for anxiety, we talked about sort of talk therapy would be the right first step. Then if you go to the next step of talking about medications, you want to avoid something like Valium, which is potentially addictive and over the long term has more risks than benefits when you talk about sort of memory loss and balance problems as well as being addicted to it. And antidepressants are quite effective and actually considered the first line approach, meaning the first medication we should try for anxiety would be an antidepressant. Like you were saying, there's so much in common with anxiety and depression. They both affect sleep, they both affect concentration, they both affect appetite. And antidepressants can be quite effective in a safe way at decreasing people's anxiety as well as their depression. You know, with the, I'm sorry, a lot of medications get their names based on the first thing they were used to treat. So for example, Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic, it was first used for schizophrenia. Then the thinking was that it would also help for bipolar disorder and is also an effective anxiety medication as well, particularly around addiction. So that label hangs on even though we find new uses for medications.
Right. And there might also be substance abuse involved there, and he's not going to get value. He's not going to get something like that. And maybe that's another issue that he's not mentioning that perhaps the doctor is mindful of.
Right, yeah.
But I would go back and talk and see.
Yeah.
All right. Opium has been around for thousands of years. Why is it being called an epidemic now?
Yeah, I like that because it sort of speaks to, like you said at one point, that there's nothing of itself that makes alcohol bad, that makes opioids bad. It's the impact on the body and what happens when it hits the body, and our behavior and our thinking changes around that. And right, it's been around for thousands and thousands of years, and is epidemic the right term for it? It's certainly a problem these days.
That's right, and I think in some ways, it's really, I don't want to judge people, but it really is that a lot of the opiates showed up in pills form. Yeah. And people who are sort of accustomed in our society to taking pills to get symptom relief. Right. And they did a very effective job. I mean, I think the federal government actually sued pharma.
Purdue the Purdue company who manufactured OxyContin and told us that it was not addictive.
Yeah, and I think, so people took it, and I think a lot of people got involved with opiates. And, epidemic is sort of brings it into the medical field, if you will. And it just went through our communities. And I know that our Governor Shulman used that. I think he used that term. I hope I'm not wrong on that. But I've heard other people say the heroin in Vermont just spread from community to community. And I was reading in the paper, they were talking about opiate addiction in Staten Island, and the pills and the heroin and the overdoses, and such a high numbers. And they said it's second only to I think it was the Bronx, second only to the Bronx in overdose deaths. Okay. And I couldn't help thinking that in the Bronx, it's been happening all along.
Right, like you said, you met your first heroin addict 50 years ago.
Yeah, and so, but this is new where it's happening. This is different where it's happening now, and I think there's a little bit of that. And historically, a lot of opiate addicts were inner city, urban places. Right. Washington, D.C., Baltimore, New York, Newark, Philadelphia, Chicago, places like that. But when opiates and pills, it went through West Virginia, went through all the other places, and then became widespread because of the way that pharmaceuticals work, and they sell they're all sales reps. And so it seemed like it spread across the country really quickly. It used to be that opiates were in one location, one population, one area, and now it's all over. And I think that's the difference, is that it's no longer confined, if you will, but it's not new. It's definitely not new.
It's now affecting people who are connected, right? It's hit the middle class, and they have access to media, political power, and I think that's a piece of why we're seeing some more attention and an epidemic. But then too, the other day I was listening to someone who was sort of an advocate for legalization of many different substances, and made the comment about, back in the day, maybe people took a hit of a pipe of opium after a hard day's work. But I think a piece of the problem is that the potency of the medications we have now is so much greater than anything that was around before, when people were sort of taking it more in sort of the plant form, a more natural form. And so it really then just gives an effect in the brain that is much greater than anything people experienced 100,000 years ago. While it's still always been serious,
Yeah.
I think that's a big piece of it these days too, is the potency.
You know, I've interviewed so many clients over the years, and they've always, many of them have talked to me about feeling a certain way until the day they used. And then when they used it, they felt complete. If, you know, as that movie Fill the Hole, whatever it was like, this is the right thing. And I think for a lot of folks, you can be exposed to drugs or alcohol. And if it's just like something that you do, but it doesn't really do anything special for you, you could take it or leave it or use a lot of it and stop or whatever. But I think for some people, there's a significant something missing. Something's not right. They're not content. They're not at peace with themselves. And they take this very powerful drug. And it really, I mean, it just makes you feel so good and all right about yourself that at that point it almost becomes, why wouldn't I do it? Not like, why do I do drugs, but why wouldn't I do drugs? It makes me feel good. And I don't like who I am, and yet I love being high. And so I think for those folks, you know, opiates are so powerful, and as a narcotic, that all they needed was access and availability. In other words, they didn't have it before. It wasn't everywhere. They couldn't buy it. They didn't go down someplace and buy 10 bags of heroin. You know what I mean? It was sort of, their introduction to opiates was local, was at home. And from there, you know, a lot of it has to do with access and availability, and, you know, a willingness to give things a try. And I think that's one of the things that happened in Vermont.
Yeah, and people wonder too, is maybe people are less satisfied, more stressed these days, and therefore with that and the availability of these drugs.
Or I think they miss spirituality, but that's another topic.
Well, that's a big topic, but it's something to think about.
Okay, all right. We'll talk about it.
All right, so this next one, this seems to have a holiday theme to it. Can an addict drink alcohol without relapse to heroin?
Well,
you can and you shouldn't would be the short answer.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You can drink if you want to drink. It's a really high-risk thing to do.
Yeah.
Most people will tell you that alcohol is a drug, and eventually you'll end up at your drug of choice. That's not always true. Some heroin addicts put it down. They go on methadone, and they just stop doing heroin, but they drink more because it's legal. I think you just have to balance it. If you had a history of drinking prior to your heroin use, I can almost guarantee you that even if you don't go back to heroin, you'll drink an awful lot. I mean, you will drink to a point of, you know, being an alcoholic, quite frankly.
And then I read a paper in an addiction magazine, maybe almost a year ago now, and they were looking at exactly this issue. So they were looking at people who were on methadone maintenance, so their you know, opiate dependency was under a certain level of control, and those who started to drink, and what happened to those who did. And they found that about, I think about a third or a quarter of these methadone patients wound up developing a problem with alcohol. And whether you call it sort of a substitution or picking up a new addiction, just looking at the numbers, something that happens, you know, 1 out of 3 times, I think that's worth betting on having it happen.
And people who were really, where alcohol and drug use was a way of life. I mean, you know, this is what they did. And they get clean sober. And sometimes you'll hear somebody say, you know, I picked up a drink or a drug, and by the end of the night, I was downtown buying crack. Yeah. In other words, it was really fast. I mean, it sort of went. I think that's probably the exception. I think most people, first time they relapse on a mood-altering chemical drug, nothing happens to them. And that's the worst thing that can happen.
Because then they think they're in control.
That's right. They think they, you know, I can use safely. And boy, it is so tempting to do it again. Wait a week, do 2 more, you know, wait a week. See, I got it on, and it's not heroin. It's only this, it's only that. And before you know it, at the end of 6 months, at the end of 3 months, you're right back where you were. And I think that's the real danger. I mean, if somebody, first time you relapsed and took a drug, if somebody came in and hit you with a stick, I mean, that would be ideal. You know what I mean? Like, but that's not how it works. Most of the time you get high, you get away with it, and, you know, I mean, you know, you say, well, see, I'm okay with it. And I think that's really, that's not how that works. I think the addiction is always there, alcoholism is always there, and it would love to thrive again, if you will. It would really, you know, and so.
Well, I think that the people that we know who sort of thrive in their recovery, who've been sort of, growing for, 10, 20 years in their recovery, one of the things that they almost constantly say is that they've been free of alcohol and drugs for that whole time. They've made a commitment to not using mind-altering substances because it's no longer beneficial in their lives and detrimental for the most part.
I know I made a joke about spirituality, but I really believe that on some level. I mean, that you develop spirituality in recovery. It's part of recovery, 12-step programs. And it really, it's a way of feeling good about yourself. And it's a way of understanding and accepting yourself and accepting others. And I think on some level, alcohol, pot, other drugs will give you that same feeling. You know what I mean? It will give you a sense of, oh, I'm at peace with myself, I'm stoned, I'm high, or whatever, And that critical voice is silenced. And the awareness of deficit is sort of gone. And I think, so I think on one hand, I do believe that spirituality is important in that aspect. And I think for some folks, they say, well, it's so much easier just to get stoned. I mean, it's so much easier just to have a drink. And after a while, I just think it's really dangerous. So, the answer, if you don't mind, my answer to that question is it's not worth the risk.
Right.
It really isn't. And if you think it is worth the risk, then you probably are in trouble.
Right.
It really is not worth the risk.
I think it weakens the foundation of your recovery and your spirituality.
That's right. Okay.
And then we have one more question.
All right.
When do you stop taking psych medications?
Ah.
Okay. Yeah, and a lot of, we've gone through some changes in thought on this. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, there was the idea, especially around medications for schizophrenia. And we had Robert Whitaker on the show last season talking about just this, that it was considered these were medications that you should take for life. And then came the realization that there were alterations in the brain, the balances back and forth of transmitters and neurochemicals that were actually disturbed to a degree when you're on a medication for life that then made you prone for relapse as opposed to stopping the medication causing the relapse. And there was a recent study that came out by a Dutch group, a guy named Wonderink, that looked at comparing groups who stayed on their medications for schizophrenia versus those who had not. And they found that in the short term, there are more lapses of psychotic symptoms. But when you look at the 7-year follow-up, that they were actually functioning better, the folks who did not stay on medications that whole time.
Huh. And the ones that had more frequent relapses or more
well, they didn't have more
severe,
frequent relapses, but they functioned less well. So less employment, less satisfying relationships, less independence.
But they wouldn't have schizophrenia. They wouldn't have active symptoms. Is that the idea?
Well, looking at, do we just dampen the symptoms with the medication versus in a way sort of accepting the illness, learning how to live with it, and learning to work with it in sort of the waxing and waning fashion, or relapse and remission as we talk about it. And the medications are not the be-all, end-all around treatment. There's much more to it.
When I used to talk to clients, I used to say, I'm not a doctor, I can't tell you, and neither are you. Occasionally I'd talk to a doctor and I'd have to make an exception. But, but how do you know when you're taking antidepressants and you're no longer depressed?
Is it the antidepressant is keeping
because it's working, but obviously this is a conversation you have with your doctor, right? How do you taper?
Don't stop these on your own. It's the moment you don't feel depressed. Don't think about stopping medication. And make sure that, as I talk about this in methadone too, make sure the factors around your life for a good quality life are in place. And then when that's happened, then consider very slowly and gradually coming off the medication and seeing if that is then the right approach, because there are effects for staying on a medication as well.
Right. I think in this question, and sort of as a warning sign to me, I hear the I. When do I stop my meds? And I think the answer is really we. We talk about it, talk with family, talk about your provider, talk about with other people, and then see how that should go.